Good morning, welcome and thank you for joining. This webinar is the final of two live discussions as part of the Foil launch. Foil is a data and AI consultancy with an anti-consulting ethos, and my name is Josie West. I'm going to be your host and facilitator along with my very special guests, where we'll be discussing the AI arms race, a topic that everyone is talking about, but is it worth it? With 90% of generative AI projects failing, why are we all trying to stay ahead? The conversation will aim to cover the business side of AI. If I keep us on track, we'll talk about the truth about the costs, the reality of the rewards, how to stay ahead, should we want to stay ahead, and overcoming any challenges and risks of taking steps into the unknown. Now, a little bit of admin before we start. We are live on two platforms. So we're on Teams and we're on LinkedIn Live, and we've got a total of 150 signed up to join us. So as we go through the next 45 minutes or so, we invite you to submit questions on both platforms, and we've got coordinators in the background who'll be combining them and getting them to us for us to answer at the end. Okay, so to my panelist. Now, I have to say, I, for one, am very impressed with the two people in front of me today. Dael Hulme, both CEO of AI specialist Satalia and Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer, which I don't think there's many of at the moment, at the global advertising holding company WPP. And of course, Dael Williamson, Chief Technology Officer at Databricks for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Two people, I must say, that have been actual experts in AI in this space for years, way before the ratio of AI experts to general population shot up exponentially in about 2022, maybe. Thank you very much both for joining me. Now, before we get into the crux of this conversation, I want to start with a little bit of a scene setter. So AI, artificial intelligence, is a whole box of everything. We know that behind that lies data, mathematics, algorithms, large language models, all the complexities and buzzwords with lots of different meanings and lots of different people, depending on the conversation. So Dael, I'm going to come to you first. In the context of organizations, business, enterprises, when we talk about AI, what do we really mean?
Oh, good question. So I guess I've been building AI systems for almost 2 decades now, and most systems that exist in production, you give it data and it makes a decision, and tomorrow you give it the same data, it makes the same decision, and that's fantastic because we can get computers to do things better than human beings. But the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different answer. So I would argue that these systems that are essentially automation are not AI. There are multiple definitions of AI. The most popular definition, I think, is the weakest definition, which is getting computers to do things that humans can do. It's weak for many reasons. I won't bore you with them, but if I built a machine that behaved like a mouse, that would be the most intelligent machine we've ever built. Benchmarking machines against humans is a very silly thing to do. There's a very good definition of AI that comes from the definition of intelligence, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. Systems that are able to make decisions, learn about whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt themselves so that next time they make better decisions. And if I'm being totally honest with you, most systems in production don't fit that definition. So one might controversially argue that if I held what we do in industry to that definition, nobody's doing AI, which is a ridiculous comment to make, because the fact is, over the past several decades, new advances in algorithms plus data plus compute allow us to do some incredible things. So instead of looking at AI through definitions or technologies, I've been developing a framework over the past 10 years that looks at AI through applications. Now, applications are consistent regardless of the technology. I won't go into the details of these 6 applications right now, but I believe that any friction that exists across any supply chain in any industry can be mapped to one of or more of these 6 applications. So let's look at the lens of applications, and then what that does is it prevents organizations then from from getting seduced by technologies and then trying to apply technologies to solving problems that are the wrong problems for those technologies. Like we saw, 7 years ago, people hiring machine learning experts to solve the wrong problems. And now what we're seeing is people hiring generative AI experts also to solve the wrong problems. So let's look at AI through applications to keep ourselves honest.
Yeah, okay. So, and it's that decision making is an interesting part, right? It's all about being able to answer questions and make decisions easier, but through the decisions that are needed to be made rather than just doing technology for technology's sake. Okay. Dael, now you've worked in this space for many years as well, and with Databricks, of course, being one of the leaders in the space, there's a lot of the capability. Yes, there's new capability that's come about, but a lot of this has been around for a very long time. Why now? Why are we having this conversation and there's a plethora of experts all over the place suddenly, and it's the only thing anyone's talking about? Why now?
I think it's an accessibility thing. So it's kind of funny. Databricks' origin story was, Spark's first use case was ML. And then very quickly realized that you needed data to fuel ML. So Databricks, data and AI. It was really weird when I first joined. We used to shout data and whisper AI because people were really scared of it. What ChatGPT did was it kind of made it accessible. It made it sort of mainstream. It solved it. All of the things around scaling were already being solved in the background. ChatGPT just brought it to the foreground. And that means everybody went, oh, hang on, I'll have some of that. Ironically, we've been here before over the last 60 years. So compute has helped us to scale. Distributed data processing has helped us to scale. The ability to harmonize and actually bring lots of data together has helped us to scale. And then, add in there, some of the more deterministic models, to Daniel's point, and then bringing in some of the more probabilistic things that have happened in the transformer world. Things are changing. And, so just kind of using a cross section, I'm a biochemist in the room, so I like to study companies now because I don't get to study organisms. And if you look at the 12,000 customers we have, it's kind of fascinating, those that are very AI driven versus those that are kind of starting to kick the tires and figure the stuff out. Those that actually have figured out how to harmonize their data versus those that are still trying to get off legacy. And you could see, if you kind of mapped it against the S&P Global Index, there's I think it's about a 1.55x improvement in productivity and growth, which that's bottom line, top line. So AI can make a material impact on companies. So that's probably why now. It's more accessible. But to Daniel's point, you can't solve it in the middle. You have to actually figure out what's the problem you're solving and the ultimate application that feeds into that problem. I kind of like the term. We scientifically call it compound AI systems, but colloquially, I think application's a much easier word to kind of fit people's heads around. So that's the kind of why now. It's like there's a remarkable improvement in business performance, a remarkable reduction in repetitive and mundane tasks, and that's just in the early stages of experimentation. And we do have some companies that are quite advanced. We have a lot of companies that are nowhere close to advanced. So there's a big sort of journey that everyone has to go on.
So that's a big question for me. A lot of people, a lot of us have worked in this space for a while, so understand AI, understand the limitations of it, understand the new capability that's come out. But some people are very new to this. It's been sort of shoved to us. Everyone has to understand, get hold of, see how it could impact their organization. In the grand scheme of things, Dael, this is quite an overwhelming journey for people. Where are we? Is there time now for organizations to breathe a little bit to work out how to react, or have we got more technical advancements coming?
I don't think anyone could predict that there isn't an avalanche of other technological advancements coming. But the good news for most people listening is that it's not too late to get started. There's a lot of work to be done, right? While we have managed to scale things, we also have learned that these things don't behave in ways that are reasonably predictable. Most top researchers, we have a chief scientist who will often say, we don't even know how these things work inside the machine. You know, how do we expect to explain the outcomes? So I think there's a lot that still needs to be done. And that's why you're starting to sort of see experiments working and things like that. What we do know is people can actually get their data house in order. There's value, and I use the word value very carefully. I don't know how much data is monetizable. I think we've talked a lot about that. You talked about oil not being consultative. I think there's a big appetite to say everything's monetizable. You know, if it was, why isn't it? But if you look at like how it can drive massive material value for how you run your business, hell yeah, data is really useful for that. And we've been seeing that for years. Data fuels AI. So, you know, a more deterministic path and a journey that people can kind of go through is getting their data house in order and experimenting with AI, because it's not perfectly grounded. It's still got a lot of kinks. There's still a lot of things. We have to get better at testing. We have to get better at regulating without suppressing. We have to get better at explaining. We have to get better at democratizing how we build these things. We have to complement it with other types of things. You know, just because Gen AI is the hot topic doesn't mean classical machine learning falls out the door. I actually was doing a webinar yesterday on, you know, the old school expert systems, because actually that's kind of cool. You know, that's making a comeback, and that's AI from the 80s. And it complements what we're trying to do with generative AI. So there's a whole lot of, you know, and back to Daniel's point, like the application build out, we still need to figure a lot of things out. So no one's late to this. Yeah. And that I think's the main key thing. But if you're not doing anything, you might regret it later on.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's a whole sort of deep conversation around what it's not good at that we'll come on to. Daniel, you're obviously exposed to a lot of different organizations and speak to a lot of very important people who've been doing this for a long time, but you also say, actually, there's not any good AI, I don't know the phrase that you used, in operation. If someone was coming into this and trying to work out what it could look like, we all talk about improving decision making and doing more with less and doing things quicker. What if you were to build AI or other capability around AI into your processes, decision making, ways of working? Have you seen examples of that working for an organization that you can kind of put on a pedestal to say they're doing it, it's working, and it's a good thing to do?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. We've been building AI systems for almost 2 decades, and first of all, I would say that even though systems are not necessarily adapting themselves in production, it doesn't mean to say that algorithms can't drive a massive amount of value in organizations. The fact is, if they're deployed in the right way, they're transformational. I would sort of controversially argue that companies don't have insight problems, they have decision problems. And there is an impulse, and has been an impulse over the past decade or so, that by extracting insights from data and giving them to human beings, it will lead to value. And I think that it doesn't really. In some cases, it does. I think what you need to do is you need to solve your decision-making problem first. And decision-making is, going back to Dael's point, is expert systems, it's optimization. If you're old enough, it used to be called operations research. I would solve the decision-making problem first algorithmically, and then work backwards and say what insights can allow the decision-making problem to make the algorithm make a better decision, and then what data contains the insights. And where the algorithm gets it wrong or is not confident, you make sure they have the human in the loop to make sure you're building that system in a robust and safe way. So what we've seen historically before generative AI are organizations applying traditional algorithms, optimization algorithms, particularly to solving problems across supply chain. So one of my clients is Tesco. Tesco have to route tens of thousands of vehicles every day to deliver hundreds of thousands of packages. Another client is PwC, where they're allocating auditors to jobs. And just to kind of give you an idea about the type of problem that this is I'm going to geek out for a minute, but if you have 5 staff members you need to allocate to 5 jobs, there are 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 solutions. There's 120 solutions. If you've got 15 people to allocate to 15 jobs, there are 1 trillion solutions. If you have 60 people to allocate to 60 jobs, there are more solutions than there are atoms in the universe. PwC have 5,000 people to allocate to 5,000 jobs. And the point here is that generative AI won't solve that problem. Machine learning won't solve that problem. Having deep expertise in decision-making algorithms will solve that problem. You can give more and more insights to those planners in terms of people's skills and preferences, hopes, dreams, desires, but they will not be able to solve that maths problem well beyond 7. And so start with solving the decision-making problem first, and then work backwards. And that's what we've seen be successful in organizations over the past decade.
That sounds, I mean, as an operational research graduate, I'm loving this, but I'm trying to get my head into someone who's new to this. That sounds terrifying. It sounds an algorithm that's hard to access, hard to implement. Is that straightforward? And of course, getting someone in who's an expert to support them, but is it worth that effort and thought around, to get there, to make it better, to make it more efficient?
If you apply optimization algorithms in the right way, then you can drive a huge amount of value. So, when you're dealing with companies like Tesco and PwC, even just a few percentage points in terms of improvement is more than enough for ROI. And what's interesting is if you apply these algorithms in the right way, then it can significantly outperform that. And the challenge is, how do you capture the model or the problem, the constraints, what you're trying to optimize for, and all of the constraints that sort of represent the problem, and then how do you then apply the right algorithms to solve that problem? Sometimes it takes us years, literally years, to figure out how to solve these problems, but it's so worth it to these organizations that they're willing to make those investments. And by the way, you crack it once, you crack the ability to do workforce optimization or vehicle routing, with new algorithmic approaches, and that new algorithmic approach can be applied now to lots of different industries.
And that sounds like being able to capture the knowledge of an organization to work out the constraints, rather than going in with the tech team. And
I have to ask the right questions.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. So Dael, where does generative AI come into this? Because everyone's talking about AI, and really they're talking about everything we've been speaking about so far, but there's this sort of small subset of generative AI. Does generative AI bring that value as well? Do you see that changing the way organizations work for the better?
So generative AI it's like a really sort of different supercomputer. Like the transformer model, if you deconstruct it, it's incredibly good at storing huge volumes of knowledge. But what it's also kind of tricky at is, how do you access the knowledge based on the question you're asking? So what's fascinating is to Daniel's point, like decision making, if you actually model how decisions are made in organizations, like if I drew an analogy to living systems, like they're really inefficient and they'd probably be killed by some other animal, because they are like very slow moving. I kind of always, when I think of a lot of big traditional orgs, I think of the sunfish that just floats around in the water, and maybe the sloth that just lies in a tree. There's a lot of lagging behavior that takes place, and a lot of theater that kind of bounces back and forth as people get aligned and things like that. knowledge sits in people's heads, knowledge sits in file servers, knowledge sits all over the place, and it's really hard to access. If you use generative AI in a very clever, appropriate way, it's quite good at finding these things. It's quite good at encapsulating these things. So then you have to figure out, like, how do I offset some of the behavioral issues? So lots of people are right now, I call it the hello world of generative AI. We use a massive model to solve a very small problem. Okay, and the massive model basically has the total copy of all internet traffic. So it's really good at pub quizzes, but it's not very good at knowing how your supply chain runs. I mean, it might generally know how your supply chain runs. So you have to do work to it to get there. The problem is that all that contamination inside the model is going to lead to some kind of hallucinatory effect. It doesn't matter how many guardrails you build out. So what we're starting to see.
Can I just jump in here? When you talk about the massive model, you're talking about the models that people talk about, like GPT that sits under ChatGPT, right?
Yeah. So we have to actually deconstruct this and think about, okay, let's decouple the actual available models on the market. So you have lots and lots, and every week there's a new one. I mean, Claude is now in pole position, and a couple of we created DBRX about 2 months ago. It was the best open source model in the world for about 2 weeks, and then it wasn't. And that's the thing. We didn't create it to basically feed the arms race. We created it to figure out how to do it, because how to do it is more important. What we're starting to see start to play out is more smaller specific models. So people have been kind of thinking about fine tuning and thinking about like LoRa techniques and things like that get very sensitive around knowledge encapsulation of a particular domain or a particular expertise. And then how do you bring that together with other types of tools and AI techniques? So vector databases have become a really useful tool for certain things. I believe that there's a ton of other traditional AI techniques that play a material role in that workflow. And slowly but surely, what we're starting to see is people go, okay, generative AI is expensive when your application is 80% big model, 20% little bit of logic. Actually, if you start to break that apart and then start to use it where it's appropriate, and maybe in your application landscape, it becomes 2%. Because it only does one little thing well. And then you're using a cascade of other types of models and other types of functional deterministic code. Like some of the best systems that we have use 2% of the model and some regular expressions and a bunch of other parsing functions and things like that. Like we don't suddenly throw the baby out with the bathwater. So the mitigation for how to use generative AI is to learn where it's good and where it shouldn't be used. Like it's more important to know what it's not good at. What we're starting to see play out, which is kind of cool, is small specific models. So they transformer models, but they're trained on a very specific data set. And that means they don't have contamination. It also means they're smaller, the lower the latency, smaller the model, it's actually the lower the cost to run. So it tends to solve a bunch of the expensive bits. It also gets more accurate. If you use it in a cascade, you start to offset some of those problems. So I think there's a huge maturity journey that everyone's going to go on, and there's a huge unlocking journey as we start to get better at it. We still have another problem, which is we don't all have access to, there's GPU poor and GPU rich companies. We don't have access to enough chips to be able to do this stuff and use big models all the time. So that constraint's actually a healthy thing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. It's the strategy around how and why you're using large language models and other types of the application of AI or data to solve your decision and your problem that you have in hand, rather than going just to the big players or looking at that single model to solve everything. Hence the hallucinations that lots of people are talking about, and a lot of people are afraid of because they don't want to get things wrong in their organization. Just staying on costs for a moment. So you're talking about, using those models, and they're expensive, and making sure that you mitigate those costs. Daniel, in terms of other investments that leaders should be considering, what kinds of costs are we looking at? I mean, we had one of the chief data officers in Microsoft last week on a webinar talking about tech being the relatively straightforward part. The people process change is where there's a lot of effort required. What are you seeing with your clients?
Yeah, I would argue that technology is a commodity, and it has been actually for a long time. Of course, large language models are an acceleration of that commodity. The bottleneck is people and process, and so where I think organizations need to be investing is data that differentiates them, because it's data that makes AI smart. And if you've got signals that are better than your competitors, if you're leveraging them, then you'll be able to win. It's AI talent, and people, organizations really have to be honest with themselves. Can you attract, retain, motivate deep AI talent? And the reality is that they can't. And I guess 7 years ago, companies were building data lakes, and they were putting Tableau or some sort of analytics layer, and then they were hiring data scientists that would then leave after a few years, leaving a whole load of stuff, infrastructure that just wasn't able to be maintained or utilized. The same thing's going to happen again over the next 3 years. People are going to try to build careers around generative AI, hire data science teams or generative AI teams, and it not be successful. And so really be honest with yourself about how well you can engage with AI talent to build innovations. And the third that you should be investing is leadership. If your leadership are not educated and bought into the transformational power of these technologies, then you're wasting your time. That said, placing the right bets on this technology, going back to what Dael said, is very important. And I've got my own view in terms of where AI is right now and how it's going to play out. Yes, over the past 70 years, AI has been cyclic. We had very, very simple brains 70 years ago, and then we had what called multi-agent systems, and then we had brains again, and then multi-agent systems. Now we have brains, which is now turning into multi-agent systems. So essentially, instead of trying to take all of that knowledge and stuff it into one brain, and it gets confused and it's expensive and all that kind of stuff, you're then having to build these specialized agents, agentic systems that are all coordinating and collaborating. That said, I think that the next cycle after that, maybe towards the end of the decade, is a bigger brain, and maybe that's super intelligence. But I should also say that there is concern about hallucinations and things like that. But just bear in mind that for most people, AI has only been around for 2 years. At the moment, these brains are like intoxicated graduates. Those intoxicated graduates are going to graduate over the next 6 to 9 months as master's level. Reasoning is going to be a game changer. It's going to allow them to check their own hallucinations. It's going to be a step change in their intelligence. I think after then 6 to 9 months, it will graduate in 18 months to a PhD level, where you'll be able to empower it to go off and solve a complex problem. It will then be a graduate level another 18 months, and then by the end of this decade, we're most likely to have a professor in our pocket. Now, the question is, how quickly and well can you leverage that technology and bring it into your organization? It's not technology that's a bottleneck. It's going to be how well you're structured and how well you empower your employees to innovate.
It's really interesting, because what I'm hearing as someone, if I'm putting myself as a leader deciding whether to invest in it or not, all of the skeptics around they hallucinate, there's problems, and we've got loads of examples of a lawyer in the US court who quoted some cases from ChatGPT that were completely wrong, and getting in all sorts of problems. The technology is changing so quickly that we almost don't need to worry about that, because by the time we actually start using it in action and in anger, it's going to be more reliable, more better, becoming this professor in your pocket. So then, just touching on the people and the data and the leadership, that sounds, particularly data, very boring. To someone who's seen this capability and has access to this capability, what would be your answer to that?
Well, I think just to close off the technology thing as well, is that there is emerging technology that's coming out of academia called neuromorphic computing. There's quite a lot of scrutiny on the energy required to build large language models, train them, etc. Over the next 5 years, we're going to have models that are much more aligned with actually how our brains work. Large language models, not how our brains work. They are highly, they require a lot of energy. They take a lot of time to train, etc. Neuromorphic computing, or what are called spiking neural networks, are incredibly energy efficient. Our brains operate on the power of a light bulb. We learn very quickly. There's new emerging technologies that are also going to be a game changer. But to answer your question, it's going to sound really boring, but organizations have tons of frictions. There are frictions from a kind of core productivity perspective. How can we write PowerPoints better or emails better, etc. And most of that's going to be solved with co-pilots and the tools that Google and Microsoft are introducing into those technologies. The second kind of layer is looking at your supply chain. There are opportunities for you to apply AI to differentiate your business, to accelerate your digital transformation. How can you make sure you're placing the right bets on the right technologies to solving those frictions that differentiate you from your competitors? And that requires asking the right questions. It requires being pragmatic about building the right business cases and all of that boring stuff. And then I guess the other question that you should be asking yourself as a leader is my industry going to be completely disrupted by AI? I think retail and things like that are less prone to disruption because they're a little bit more immune because they have to move goods around and all that kind of stuff. Whereas media, marketing, communication is going to be completely disrupted, right? We can produce content 10 times more quickly, more efficiently. So what do you need to do to disrupt yourself as an organization and not just accelerate your digital transformation? I think these are the questions that leaders need to be asking themselves.
Great. And then to Dael, sort of extension to that question, if you're an organization, great if you're really innovative and you're thinking ahead and you're already trialing this stuff. What about the organizations that have a small budget? They want to do it. They're in an industry that they know is going to see disruption. Where do they focus that investment? How do they know that they're sort of taking that right step, even though it's a relatively ambiguous journey?
So I think we often tend to over pivot onto like ROI, which is very kind of linear. If you kind of deconstruct the algorithm for return on equity, you have kind of three main numerators. You have do it faster, cut out costs, and growth. Okay, I think that this technology, to Daniel's point on friction, there's a lot of bloated cost that's preventing a lot of these companies. So if you have a small budget, you are actually spending a lot of your big budget on stuff that's unnecessary. You probably have a ton of stuff that you can consolidate and clean up and reduce and sort of solve for. Like you probably have a spray of heterogeneous technologies that you bought over time. You probably have a lot of antiquated supply sort of areas that you're spending money unnecessarily. So it's a good time for discipline and a good time for hygiene. If you then move into the do it faster, there's points of process layer work that humans do in their day-to-day jobs that are grossly unnecessary. So I'll give you a fun example. Internally, we have 1,500 people in product and engineering. Okay, they are building the platform. Now, one would say, how do we get cognitive focus for those people to move forward? And we have a reputation for being pretty innovative. So cognitive load is a massive drain on people's time. And there's a couple of ingredients to it, like that we've measured out. One of those is, when you're solving for customer problems, like customer mean time to resolve, like customer support issues, like there is a huge amount of waste and friction that can be solved by sort of applications built with a variety of these different AI types of tools. And we found we could reduce that by about 25%. So that's a whole lot of time back to your engineers. If you then move to frequently asked questions, now come on, like that is that like the web page where you have to kind of search through that. that's a great area where you can kind of reduce a lot of friction. So people are not answering the same question 400 times.
Right.
One of the key areas, like imagine you can replace meetings with a model. So we have so many meetings to align. What if I wrote something down, fed it to the model, and then people can ask the model, and that's how they get their alignment? So we're experimenting with this idea because lots of teams having to align means lots of teams are not actually getting stuff done, means innovation stifled. So when I use the return on equity equation and I look at the doing things faster or more efficiently, and actually ultimately it's more efficiently, more effectively. So how do we reduce the input time relative to output? And how do we increase the quality or maintain the quality of that output? Those are important questions, fundamental questions. And then the cost reduction is a fundamental question. Growth is hard. Like, I don't think we're ready for this to do some sort of material areas of growth. We actually don't know how this, I think that there's experiments that can be done on the growth side, but you will be able to really justify how you increase your budget by decreasing your spend elsewhere and improving your productivity elsewhere. So there's ways to move levers around. I'll end with a point. I had a person who told me at a Gartner conference that he is responsible for the digital transformation of his company, but his mandate is profitability. So profitability sits at the intersection between growth and productivity, meaning bottom line and top line. And that's an incredibly cool, sophisticated way of thinking about how do I pull levers when I don't have budget to access more funding, mm-hmm. and how do I pull levers when I've actually achieved growth to access more funding. And there's an interplay that could actually be a vehicle to doing this in a far more data-driven, far more financially sensitive way. Because you're not, to Daniel's point, you got to place bets on the technology, but the technology is ultimately commodity, and you can be quite disciplined about that. But there's a huge amount in the people and process layer that you can seriously influence. And education's a massive area. Like, how are you educating your current people to do their jobs better? What are their jobs? And how do their jobs evolve in this new world? Or even if you're a retailer, like, what would a retail job, even though it's a less likely disruptable area, how would that job evolve? And we've been through this before. Mobile change jobs in retail. It's not like people are unfamiliar with this. It's not like it hasn't happened in a century.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing, isn't it? Is that those that are, let's move away from leaders of organizations, but individuals perhaps listening to this conversation, feeling overwhelmed. And I think there's an important step that people need to sort of see, that there's been a journey where people learnt the internet and learnt CRM systems and learnt social media, and now there needs to be a step where they are inquisitive and thinking about that sort of AI and engagement with AI. I'm trying to not use the term prompt engineering, but being able to engage with AI. One of my final questions before we get to some other questions coming through, because we have had quite a few, is this a race to the bottom? Now, people use this phrase with me all the time, a race to the bottom, which essentially means we're trying to do everything faster, cheaper, doing more. I am a big believer in the value of the human. Where does the value of the human come into this? If at the extreme end, we're trying to do everything faster, cheaper, do more, where's the balance between that? Daniel, I'll throw that question to you.
There's a very good HBR article. I think it's called the Consumer Value Pyramid. And what they've done is they've kind of mapped things that humans value to sort of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And of course, faster, better, cheaper is at the bottom, convenience, etc., all the way through to, does this create nostalgia? Does it make me feel connected? Does it educate me? Does it help me, feel sort of transcended? Am I contributing somehow to humanity as we go up this hierarchy? And the reality is, I think it's both things. One is I would love for things to be faster, better, cheaper. I think if we can remove the friction from the creation and dissemination of food, healthcare, education, transport, energy, you can bring the cost of those goods down to almost zero. And I think it would be amazing if we lived in a world where everybody on this planet can access the goods that they need to educate themselves, to feed themselves for free. So as far as I'm concerned, faster, better, cheaper is definitely a direction we should be going. That said, I'm hoping that frees people up to use their creativity to then enrich humanity, which means how do we make people feel nostalgic and connected and give people the opportunity to contribute to humanity in a way that feels they're transcended. So I'd like to see AI helping with both. And I think that if we applied ourselves over the coming years, we can actually make that happen. And ironically, the capitalistic model is sort of accelerating this concept of abundance. And what I mean by that is, Meta has obviously open sourced their models, and they've not done that from the goodness of their own heart. They've done it because it doesn't hurt their business model to do that. It hurts Google and Microsoft to make their models free because they charge cloud. And but what's happened with Meta, and you'll see this more and more, is that companies will make their innovations available because it will give them access to data, it will make them look cool, and it will also give them access to talent. And ironically, that is also going to accelerate this concept of abundance. Like how many mobile phones do you throw away over 3 years? Maybe 1 or 2. If we could give a mobile phone to everybody on this planet and give them access to the internet, then education becomes free. And not only that, is that these large language models are also going to most likely be free to people to allow them to build code, create apps, create businesses. I think if we played our cards right, we can actually bring the cost of those things down to zero, yet then enable people to create things that enrich our lives.
So I loved the answer, and I feel like I could talk about that for hours. I'm going to be the skeptic for the business leader. What is their responsibility, right? Because this feels like the big dogs, big players creating the algorithms and who have a lot of power. What about the leader who's bringing AI into their organization? How do they make sure they have that value and that consideration when they're doing this?
I think they have a responsibility to their shareholders. They have a responsibility to themselves and their colleagues to make sure that they're deploying these technologies in a responsible and fair way, and they've got a responsibility to enabling the organization to achieve their purpose. I mean, I'm a huge fan of organizations that don't just have a profitable business but actually have a purpose, and they're true to that purpose. Because if AI can help organizations accelerate and achieve their purpose, if you kind of add up all of the purpose of enterprise, you end up creating a future that's glorious for all of us. So I think we need to hold our leadership account to make decisions that are just beneficial, but both beneficial to shareholders, investors, and also the purpose.
Yeah, but and straight back to your point around the third point, leadership, and making sure leadership have that engagement. Okay, so I'm going to end on a final question to you both. I want to end on some real practical, tangible advice to the people listening to this conversation. What is their first step to move forward successfully? Dael, what would be your advice?
Well, I started the conversation with accessibility, and I'm going to end the conversation with accessibility. I remember having this. So I've got a 5-year-old who was complaining to me about Netflix doing the Wheel of Death thing because my 2-year-old had switched off the router, and I was sitting in the car explaining to her how Daddy used to get videos from Blockbuster and how much time that took, and all the steps along that whole journey, even down to kind of maybe the video that I'd got, the VHS, didn't fit in or didn't rewind, or was cloudy because the tape was stretched, and all these sorts of things, and she thought I was crazy. And I think what I'm getting at is, this stuff is actually way more accessible than people realize. So never in a time have we had such an abundance of learning material that is free online for you to learn this, like how this stuff works. Every company is freely uploading course material to educate yourself. And it can go very deep. So the inner workings of what a token and a chunk means, all the way up to like just understanding how to interpret it and how this stuff can be used in your everyday life, and examples of, you know, how to experiment. You can download some of these apps for free. So I used Perplexity to fix my microwave the other day. It took me 30 seconds. That's, you know, not having to find a manual, not having to do a lot of Googling to find a video. So there is an incredible amount of efficiency it creates in your own life if you use it. I've got a friend who runs a construction company. He uses Perplexity all the time for like everything, and he uses it to learn stuff. So I think everybody has accessibility to the education. And you can just literally go do that. Like IBM's got great courses, Databricks has great courses, Google's got great courses. Do a variety of them to eliminate some of the bias from that. Okay, number two, tools are easy. Like the amount of people I know that are building their own AIs. So like you can do everything from going to character AI and creating a friend or a girlfriend, apparently, to building your own assistant at home based on some data you might have. Like these are not hard projects to pick up. Even if you're not a Python programmer, you know, you can kind of pick this up. So this is like the every person democratize, take command and get to know how this stuff works. As leaders, I think you have to seek out the experts and get a variety of education. Put all us experts, because everyone has bias, and so will these models. Put us all in a room to try and eliminate the bias and try to get reasonable explanations. So I can't even tell you how many boards that I speak to in combination with, you know, people I would ultimately be partnering with or competing with. So get leaders educated. They need to know, how real is this? You know, what are the impacts and how do we use this in a practical way? So I think those are two very, very simple takeaways. And then the third one is run experiments at work and do it in the areas of your process layer that make no sense. So my favorite example is like, if you're going to trawl through, like, let's say you own a commercial building, you know, portfolio, and you have a concrete legislation that comes in that's going to change the risk profile of your buildings. Don't go read 72,000 survey documents by yourself or with an army of lawyers and actuaries. Go actually just use a model to try trawl through it and give you here are the 5 buildings you actually need to read the surveys for. I think that there are simple ways to take a huge amount of stupid work out of work. And actually learn how the stuff works in reality. So those are just 3 very, very practical examples of what I tell people to do.
Great, thank you, Dael. And same question to you, Daniel. Any kind of first step to move forward successfully?
Listen to this podcast. Is a
I
guess. No, I guess the point here is that I think educating yourself in terms of, you know, what these technologies can and can't do is obvious, but, you know, we're always surprised by people getting seduced by the hype and misinvesting. And I would also say, you know, start with the problem. What problems, what frictions do you have? Let's, you know, write them down and then approach how we solve those, or whether you even want to solve those yourself, right? Does it differentiate you, or is it going to be a commodity? Should you buy it from a third party? Should you, whatever partner? And so just being sort of super pragmatic about how to bring these technologies into your business, which requires education.
Yeah, it's that kind of, I've heard the phrase AIQ a lot, just educating yourself in what it means. Yeah. Thank you both. So we've got a few questions. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'll go to one of them and see if we can get any more in. What are some common pitfalls or mistakes you've seen companies make when implementing AI, and how can they be avoided? Full circle in this 90% of Gen AI projects are failing. What would your advice be? Who wants to take that one?
I can list a bunch of, because often we get brought in when somebody's sort of stuck pre-production, and like, what do we do? So unpredictable cost drift, like you need to know what this thing's going to cost before you push it live, because it's one thing to train and prepare, it's another thing entirely to run and drive inference. Zero control over your model, that's a tricky one, because what most companies are starting to realize is your IP is your data. How are you thinking about what data is commodity versus what data is sensitive? Most people have never tagged and classified. They don't even know PII data, and we're like 6 or 7 years into GDPR. They've got some work that's done, but probably not universally. What's IP sensitive? The fear of quality, that's the education thing. You're going to have hallucinations, you're going to have misinterpretations. You have to kind of learn. I often joke with like leaders when they want to turn around and say, well, these things aren't accurate, they hallucinate. I'm like, well, so do your people when they're reading a report to you. You've got inherent human bias, and you have, maybe they were out drinking last night, and you've got even more inherent human bias because they're not at their best. So like, I think I think don't put it in a business critical area, but just get it to work. Security, governance, and potential brand impact. Consider those things. Be wise about what you're doing. Portability. If you create this thing here, is it portable to there? Where do you want to run it? How do you want to run it? Like, people don't really think about the operational impact of how they're building these systems. They don't really think about the long term. They're very short term at the moment. And I think those ultimately end up, in addition to the people and process aspects, those end up being the real like rational aspects. People and process is slightly more irrational, and you have to kind of deal with the psychology of that. And it's not being cruel, it's just being conscious of the change that you're driving and the fear that will actually have on people. But rationally, there's a lot of very, very simple steps that you can follow through. And I think more and more, like, the education's getting better in the practical steps you follow.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dael. I've got another question here, Daniel. I'm going to throw it to you on responsible AI and ethical AI. So the question is, how do companies ensure they're able to keep up while not finding themselves in the same place DPD did? I think this is the story of a chatbot that was causing a nuisance to their customers. So how do companies ensure they're able to keep up with that AI arms race, but not finding themselves in difficulty ethically?
Okay. So I guess there's quite a lot of people that have rebranded themselves as AI ethicists. I've got a relatively controversial view, which is there's no such thing as AI ethics, which is, the reason why I say that is because the difference between humans and AIs is that AIs don't have intent. Human beings have intent, and it's intent that needs to get scrutinized from an ethics perspective. I just want to kind of join this answer up to also answering the previous question, which is AI projects don't fail typically because of ethical problems. They fail for the same reason why software fails, which is if you are not good at deploying scalable software, you're not going to be good at deploying AI. If you don't have the right data, if you don't have the right skills in your team, if you don't have the right investment to support, maintain, if you don't have buy-in from stakeholders, the whole, all of that stuff that applies to software applies to AI. I guess the only additional thing that you have to consider from an AI perspective, by the way, is not ethics, because it's the same for any technology. Is the intent, is the intended use of this technology okay or not, whether it's AI or just general technology? Once you've got over the ethics question and you've got over all of the other challenges of deploying scalable software, there are two other questions you need to ask yourself from a safety perspective, which is, are my algorithms explainable? The difference between software and AIs is that a lot of AIs are not, you don't understand how they're making the decisions. And if your AIs are making decisions that have a material impact on your employees, on your customers, on people's lives, you need to make sure they're explainable. Not just because you need to tick the EU AI Act, but because by making explainable algorithms, it makes them transparent, auditable, governable. It solves a lot of these kind of questions that are surrounding AI responsibility. So are they explainable? And by the way, not only building scalable software is hard, but building scalable AI software that's explainable is also hard. And you need to be really sober about that. The second safety question you need to ask yourself is not what happens if this goes wrong. AI engineers think about software and think about what happens when the software goes wrong. We identify the failure points and we try to build solutions that mitigate those failure points. What you have to ask yourself with AI, which is I think quite unique, is what happens if it goes very right? For the first time ever, AI can move the needle so much that it can actually end up causing harm elsewhere in the supply chain. So you focus on a KPI, a goal, it massively overachieves the goal, but it causes harm elsewhere. And the classic example is if you ask an AI to eradicate cancer, the easiest way is to eradicate human beings, right? That's the fastest way. And actually there have been many situations where we've built systems where it's overachieved its goal and it's actually potentially caused problems elsewhere. So AI is the same as software, except make sure it's explainable and make sure that you've considered what happens if it goes very right.
A fantastic answer, and again another rabbit hole that I'm not going to jump into 4 minutes before the end of the webinar. So I don't think we have time for a final question because I want to make sure we finish on time. So from me, thank you everyone from listening on both Teams and LinkedIn Live. Some fantastic conversation, as I was expecting, discussion, and also lots and lots of questions that have come through that we haven't got to. So we'll try and get those answered when we do the follow-up email. I'm certain we could talk on for hours and hours about this, but alas, attention spans through webinars wilter. So I will draw it to a close as promised for 12 o'clock. The final plug from me from Foil is if you are considering your journey with AI, but you don't know where to start, I have a little nugget of good news. As the final celebration of our launch, we're offering a workshop to a handful of organizations. So these sessions help companies explore what AI means for them specifically, and how do they get started practically. So if you want to be one of those, please reach out on either platform, whichever you're listening on, and we can tell you more. Otherwise, this marks the end of our launch. So 3 weeks full of new information, exciting news, all about Foil, the data and AI consultancy with an anti-consulting ethos. That's it from me. But a massive thank you to my panelists. As I said, I was really excited to talk to you both today, and you haven't disappointed. So thank you, Daniel, Chief AI Officer at WPP. Thanks very much, Daniel. And Dael Williamson, Chief Technology Officer at Databricks for Europe, Middle East and Africa. Thank you, Dael. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you both. Thank you for everyone else who's been joining, listening and contributing. Have a great day. I will end the webinar here. Thanks all. Take care.